Oops. Mm-hmm. Okay, so magic identities in games. There are like two main ways in which magic can be used in games to create identity or be one of the main basic elements of that identity. One is that magic can be used in games as a part of character creation process and as skills or characteristics of either single individual, faction, or the whole race in the game. So, starting with one of the most classic role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. Mostly focusing on editions from 3 to 5. Magic is used in these games, in those systems for character creations. And one of those is during the moment when the player chooses class of their character. So two main categories of classes in Dungeons and Dragons are magic classes, so classes that allow players to use magic, specifically spells, or so-called fighter classes, so classes that mostly focus on using weapons, or magical or magic-like skills that are not specifically spells. So I divided it more like classes that allow specifically for casting magical spells, not magical or magic-like skills. The next way the magic can influence the identity of the character that is created is the source of this magic power for the character we are creating. And one of the main divides in discourse about Dungeons and Dragons is so-called divine versus arcane. So characters for which source of the magic power are gods or very powerful deities, demons, or basically any kind of creature that has great enough magical power that they can allow others to use them. So in this category would be, of course, priests and paladins as classes that serve various gods, but also we would have to include in this category warlocks, which gain their power by making pacts with very powerful beings. On the other hand, in the category of the arcane would be characters which gain their magic power by either studies and research, or because they were born with magical powers. So in this case, a good example would be the class of sorcerers who are born with magic powers, and they can use very few spells, but the source of these spells is their blood, their ancestry. Other way Dungeons and Dragons allow or depict magic or use magic for players to create the identity of the characters are different subclasses or using additional rules in the rule books that allow for using of very specific kinds of magic. So for example, if a player creates character of priest of a paladin, not only part of the identity of this character is that this character is serving a god, But the also important part of the identity will be also which god they are serving, because depending on the choice of the god, the character will have access to specific kinds of magic. Like if priest serves this god, they will have access to, for example, healing magic or illusionary magic. But to have access to more warlike magic, they would have to be a priest or a paladin of different god. The second way in which Dungeons and Dragons use magic for helping creating identity for the characters is also races that players can choose, because in Dungeons and Dragons, some of the races that players can choose from which their characters are also have magical powers or affinity for specific kinds of magic. For example, good example would be half elves are resistant to mind control magic. Or even races can get specific magical abilities, or they will be casting spells of the specific kind better. Or if they try to cast a spell and player needs to beat some kind of test to see if the spell is successful, it will be lower for them if they are from this specific race. Different approach to using magic for identity of the character in the game is used in Legend of the Five Rings role-playing game. In this game, every quote-unquote good and legal spellcaster is also a priest. And they are like totally separate, you can say, class of people in the game world, and their main source of magic is through prayer to kami, so the local gods. So because of this, if the player wants to cast a spell with his character, he or she can achieve it by praying to the local god, so for some power, and it's actually the power of that local kami is what actually manipulates, for example, earth, water, or air, not the spellcaster himself. Also, the cultural setting of the game is that only spellcasters that are Shugenja and they gain their power through the prayer to the kami are legal spellcasters. So if a player creates a character who can use different kind of magic, or the source of this magic is different than through the prayer of the kami, to the kami, then they will be considered as evil, and magic itself will be considered evil and illegal. And if any representative of local government would see them using that magic, they would be hunted down. Examples are, for example, blood magic in this system uses blood sacrifice instead of the prayer, and blood magic is the main source of spells similar to necromancy. So, for example, bringing dead bodies back to life, bringing ghosts of dead people back to the earth for different reasons. Those spells would naturally interrupt the laws that gods gave people in the game world. So naturally, that kind of magic will be considered illegal and evil. Also, the main country in which the game is placed is quite isolationist. Sorry. So everything that is from outside is dangerous, and no one can trust it. So there are different kinds of magic in the game world from different countries from the outside, but in the country in which most games are based in and players are supposed to play in, those kind of magic would be also be considered illegal and bad because they are because the source of their power is not from the kami but from somewhere else. And if we don't know from where it is, then it is bad. The next example is Warhammer Fantasy. Like, the problem is that Warhammer Fantasy is more of the setting that one singular game. So when I talk about Warhammer Fantasy, I mean Warhammer Fantasy tabletop battle game, Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, and also digital games of Total War, Warhammer 1 and 2. So in Warhammer Fantasy setting, there is, of course, magic, and magic has various different types, like fire magic, sky magic, star magic, and many different types. And in those games, in this setting, many races have special affinities for specific kinds of magic or for all kinds of magic. For example, it's the lore of the game that, for example, elves are way better mages because of the fact they can live for thousands of years. They have more time to study magic and magic spells way longer than, for example, humans. So they naturally will be better in using all kinds of magic. Also, it's very common for elf archmages to be archmages of 2 or 3 schools of magic, when in case of humans, in most cases they are specialists and archmage only in one school of magic, because they had only so much time to live that they could specialize in only one. But other interesting thing is that for example, race of orcs in Warhammer Fantasy setting is part of their identity is also based on magic, because orcs have access to race-specific magic of war, and only orcs can use this kind of magic, because this magic is this magic and power and how powerful this magic is depends mostly on how many orcs are in one specific area. So the bigger the orc horde is, the more magic potential that horde has. So if the shaman will try to tap into this power and cast some kind of spell from the WAG magic, the bigger the horde, the more powerful the spells. And in my opinion, the more interesting like relationship between magic and identity of the whole race or the faction in Warhammer Fantasy setting is the example of race of dwarves, because in this setting, the lore tells us that dwarves have such negative affinity to magic that they cannot use normal magic as elves, humans, or other races, because they are they are so not compatible with it that they cannot use any kind of spells of normal schools of magic. But on the other hand, the bonus of this situation is that they cannot use this magic, but they are very resistant to it too. So in a way, the main one of the main characteristics of dwarves as a race in Warhammer Fantasy is that they are basically, one can say, anti-magic. They cannot use magic as other races, but they are also mostly resistant to it, or for some kinds of magic they are even immune. Another example, this time of digital game, is the game Endless Legends. Endless Legend, which is a 4X type of game, so similar to like Civilization or Humanity. And in this game, every race is defined by one or two specific attributes or some kind of specialization that has a great influence on the game mechanic. And not any other race can use the same ability or the same skill. Also, in this game, we have a resource that is called the dust, and the dust has magical properties, and every race has some kind of mechanic or ability connected to this dust, and it can give magic-like effects. Mostly, it's like one race can use dust to buy increase to production, for example, for few turns. So it's so they are like magical effects that will help the race in some way, but they are not actual like what we would call magic or magical spells. The only exception is the race called Ardent Mages, and this is the only race in the game that can use magic in the form of spells. So they are the only faction in the game who have units that instead of using weapons or using some other skills, they attack enemies by casting spells. So the main characteristic of this specific race is ability to use spells, and this is the one thing that they have, and no one else can use it. There is a mechanic in the game where, despite of what race player plays, they can hire special heroes of other races that are in game. So technically, player can play other race and hire hero from Ardent Mages faction, and this hero can cast spells or use them, but this is the only unit that can do this, and it's specifically said that they are from this faction. And there are also mechanics that some faction don't work particularly good with themselves. So technically, player can hire this specific hero, but the hero will be not as effective working for this particular faction than he would be if he was hired by the player who plays Ardent Mages faction. And another very classic example of digital games is Heroes of Might and Magic series. And in this game, magic is depicted into many different ways, and it's connected to many different mechanics in the game. But it also, what is also interesting, it's also quite tightly connected to the identity of the factions, in this case called castles, the players can choose in the game. Similar to previously mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, the two main categories of factions in the game are divided into magic faction or martial faction. it doesn't mean that martial faction castles do not have mages or magic units. The main difference is that martial factions, or rather heroes from martial factions or castles, are more focused some are more focused on giving bonuses to their armies, and magical factions are more focused on their heroes being able to cast magic spells instead of supporting their armies. Also, in the series of games, I think it's from Heroes of Might and Magic 3 forward, specific factions also receive bonuses for certain types of magic. Like in many games, in Heroes of Might and Magic 2, there are many different kinds of magic, like earth magic, healing magic, fire magic, and so on. And if player plays one specific castle, then heroes from this castle will have more abilities and skills to even further make their spells from certain schools of magic more powerful.
Miłosz,
Also,
maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, and this consumes the time of your questions, just to give you the time scope.
Yeah, this is the last one. And the main, the main faction in the Heroes of Might and Magic series that is mostly defined by the depiction of the magic in the game is actually Necropolis, because this faction has ability to cast necromancy spell. And what is most interesting is that heroes from other castles can learn spells from other factions, but necromancy can be learned only by the heroes from the necropolis. No other heroes from other factions can learn necromancy. And thank you very much.